Thank you for joining. Thank you
is
for
with
having
the
me.
NTA Network Current Affairs Unit.
Thank you.
Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, this is now your first time on platform, where you have had several series of appearances on platform. But let's begin from the issue which is related to the focus of this edition. The tenure of the 8th National Assembly ends in June. What, in your assessment, is the performance of the 8th National Assembly?
I think there are a number of key issues. The first one is that, as with previous parliaments, it was able to assert its autonomy relative to the executive or the presidency. You will recall that at the very beginning of the parliament, the leadership that arose was a leadership that the presidency did not want. But in principle, in furtherance of the principle of legislative autonomy, the two houses went ahead to choose the leadership they wanted. And in the case of Senate, they even went, for the first time in our history, of having a deputy Senate president from an opposing party. That had never happened previously. I think that was a positive outcome, because our laws, our constitutions are clear. The legislature is autonomous, is independent, and it has every right to choose whatever leadership it desires. The second thing we can say in assessing the 8th National Assembly is that in the conduct of its affairs, it made some key promises that it did not keep to. In particular, it promised it will give us all the details of their income and remuneration, and at the end of the day, it wasn't forthcoming. That was very disappointing for all Nigerians who wanted transparency and accountability, especially within the context that there have been information circulating that they are one of the highest paid legislatures in the world, which for a country that's relatively poor is surprising. Nigerians wanted to know the veracity of the figures they've seen circulating, and the 8th National Assembly failed in getting Nigerians to know the veracity. The third key issue about the 8th National Assembly is its conduct in terms of the budget. For the first time, we got significant details about distortion of the budget by members of the National Assembly, and in particular, the phenomenon which has joined Nigeria's political lexicon of budget padding. What was released after the conflict between Honorable Jibrin and the leadership of the House of Representatives is that individual members of the legislature will put projects for their names, for their constituencies, that was selfish, that was self-centered, and completely distorted the functioning of the budget system in the country. For example, they will put also, every legislator will put roads in their villages. These roads are leading to nowhere, and we're completely messing up the national structure of infrastructural development. And that was really a very unfortunate development. The final point I want to make in terms of the 8th National Assembly was the persistent conflict between the executive and the legislature. There was no cooperation, there was no collaboration, and the two parts of government worked at cross purposes. That is extremely negative. The Constitution assumes that the legislature and the executive will work closely together, but that was not what we observed, and I think that was unfortunate.
Yeah, that as an introduction, I think your introduction is professorial. But let's look at the issue of bills or laws passed or does not pass, and then, of course, support of the National Assembly to critical institutions like INEC, EFCC, ICPC, and others.
Well, let me first make a general point that this National Assembly produced an enormous number of bills.
You mean the 8th National Assembly?
The 8th National Assembly, yes, which is still in session. I don't have the exact number, but what we've observed over the past 2-3 years is that members of the National Assembly propose essentially personal projects for their constituencies. For example, so many bills were passed establishing polytechnics, colleges of education, universities, and all this as private members' bills. Lots of associations, private associations, went to the National Assembly, lobbied, and will get their private associations incorporated as a government agency. That is totally unacceptable in a democracy. You cannot use government resources to run private associations. And you cannot have a situation in which each legislator will simply invent an agency or an institution and set it up in their localities. For example, we have a Ministry of Education that has a national plan for the development of educational institutions. This 8th National Assembly will totally disregard these existing plans. It will totally disregard the availability of resources for such agencies and simply set them up. I think that was something that was extremely disturbing about the 8th National Assembly.
Okay, Prof, I want you to also, part of your assessment for the 8th National Assembly is to look at the political intrigues that played out and some other controversies. There were lots of notions about that. How in any way did that affect the legislative proceedings?
I think it did to a very significant extent. You will recall that both the President of the National Assembly and the Speaker of the House of Representatives emerged against the wishes of the presidency and the executive. And the way in which Senate in particular had a deputy president from another party really irritated and angered the presidency. And that set in motion very serious conflicts between the two levels of government. And that affected a lot of government business. When, for example, the chairman of the EFCC's name was sent to Senate for confirmation, it was rejected over and over again. And what emerged from the rejection was the way in which there was significant confusion in government itself, because the president proposes somebody as chairman, and another agency of government, in this time a security agency, will write the Senate and say, don't approve the proposal from the president. That shows a certain level of disharmony, if not confusion, in the operations of the government. And this was all related to the ways in which the presidency was extremely upset with the leadership of the National Assembly. My key point on this matter really is that the constitutional provision is about collaboration between the Senate, the House of Representatives on the one hand, and the executive or the presidency on the other. And what we saw in this 8th National Assembly was that that collaboration was extremely weak, if not non-existent. And continuously you had conflicts between the two of them. For example, when the issue of the former secretary to the government involved in corruption came up, and the National Assembly investigated and found out there was a case against him, the president, for a very long time, refused to act on the matter. And that created more conflict, but also serious challenge in terms of the anti-corruption stance of the government. And I think that type of challenge reveals the serious strain that existed between the two institutions.
Well, let me take you back to the bill, 2019 appropriation bill you mentioned earlier in your assessments. Now, are we likely to see a possibility of a quick passage? There might be excuse for this year because of the elections that just concluded, but last year we saw about 7 months or so before it was passed, and according to the federal government, that delayed some key projects. You know, if we're looking at a January to December fiscal cycle, what are the possibilities of the quick passage of the 2019 appropriation bill?
It's very difficult to say whether there will be a quick passage, but the first thing to note is already there has been a lot of time that has gone, I think almost 3 months,
yes,
since that budget was presented to the National Assembly. And it's only now that they are beginning to even look at it. This means that it's going to take quite a lot of time before they finish that process. But then they do have a timeline in which they have to conclude it, because the first week of June, the 8th National Assembly will close. So they have to finish it within that period, which means whatever happens, we are going to remain in the normal, if we can say normal, timing of 6 to 7 months to process the budget.
Okay.
You discover from these remarks Prof has made that there is a basic problem with the budgetary process. And this is not about blame allocation, as it were. The point has been made already about the conflict. The seed of conflict was sown during the emergence of the leadership of the National Assembly. And then there were no conscious, deliberate, persistent attempts to paper over the cracks in the list so that the business of governance would go on smoothly. And so that fractious relationship between the executive and the legislature was manifested in the operations of both arms of government. What I find disturbing and a bit unacceptable is the proposition that the legislature was more of the drag on the governance process. So there was actually sort of more of the blame on the National Assembly, you know, which I think is kind of misplaced. Why do I say that? If the budget is delayed for this long, as we have seen in the lifetime of this National Assembly, the question should be, when was the budget submitted to the National Assembly? Is it the expectation that the budget is submitted and then the legislature rushes through it and brings it back like a rubber stamp? You and I know that there is a process, a long process.
Are you directing the question to me or to Prof?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm responding to, you know, the interjections you made. You know, so the question would be, the political attempts to make one arm of the government look like, okay, the drag, look like the bad guy here, and the other one is, oh, they are the ones who are making us not make progress. Is this something that should have occurred? Should it not have been that, okay, look, what has happened. The basic thing about the Constitution is that, okay, elect your leadership from amongst yourself. If the Constitution has not been breached, the law is in place, find a political solution around it and let the country move on. I asked this with respect to what seems to be playing out, you know, in the next National Assembly, where there is already these huge contestations around who becomes what, and there is very little conversations around, you know, a legislative agenda. Should we see this repeating itself?
Well, first of all, let me make the point that the budget has always been a major issue of contention between the presidency and the National Assembly for a very simple reason, which is that the Constitution is clear on roles. The role of the executive is to prepare budget estimates in line with government policy and submit same to the National Assembly. Then the Constitution says whatever the National Assembly decides becomes what is appropriated for that year. So in terms of powers, the National Assembly has ultimate powers on the budget. But I think what has happened over the last 20 years is that the National Assembly has overreached its powers. Yes, they have the ultimate power to determine the budget, but the Constitution says they can put, doesn't say that they can put anything they want in the budget, because the structure of government is straightforward. The work of the executive is done by agencies, ministries, and other parastatals. That's where the expertise is to conduct government business. And that's why government says, the Constitution says, they prepare the budget estimates, because the budget is part of ongoing policy work by the government in power. Now, when the National Assembly now removes all sorts of projects in the budget and creates new ones, it is overreaching its power, because there is a process for work of government. When you are going to construct a road, for example, by the time it comes to the National Assembly, there has been 2 years' work on it. Engineers would have designed the road, they would have assessed the cost, and they would have done all the necessary planning for that road. So when the National Assembly removes that road and puts something else which has not been planned, which has not been costed, which engineers have not worked on, it becomes a distortion of the work of government, because it means the monies they attribute for those projects have no basis in reality, because they haven't done the preliminary work that requires. So I think very clearly the National Assembly has overreached its powers on budgetary matters, and it has created a situation in which it now feels it can just put anything it wants on the budget. And that's not the sense of what the Constitution says. And I think there has to be a real effort moving forward to understand the limits of the powers of both the executive and the National Assembly. So I think that's the first thing I would say. The second thing, in terms of the conflict between the two institutions, is that it's often linked to politics. For example, when the 8th National Assembly arose, the ruling party was actually an amalgam of 4 different political parties who came together just before the elections. And they had not coalesced into a coherent political party, and were essentially functioning as factions of the party. In that context, therefore, there was still a lot of residual conflict between them, and that was what translated into the emergence of the leadership of the National Assembly. And once that leadership arose, the presidency got extremely upset that those they wanted to emerge were not those that emerged.
Okay, so Prof, now if we're looking at separation of powers, let's also look at trust in democratic institutions, which is severely dent on on how good governance plays out. And good governance, we know, is largely hinged on strong institutions. So how much confidence should Nigerians, put in this incoming 9th Assembly if we must get it right as a nation?
I think the principle of the separation of powers is very clear in its intention, which is to say the three arms of government, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, are equal, but each has its specific role and therefore should act autonomously. And this is really to protect the way in which government functions in the interest of people. And the idea is they each serve as a check on the excesses of the other. So that's the intention of the principles of the separation of powers. But that principle is always challenged by the assumption people have that one arm of government, in particular the executive, should be stronger than the others. And there's always been this attempt to assert that strength. And that's way at the beginning of the Fourth Republic. You remember at the Just Convention of the National Party of Nigeria in 1999 when...
No, PDP then.
PDP, sorry. When Obasanjo emerged as a presidential candidate of the party, there and then he offered the late Ekweme Senate presidency. And Ekweme had to say, but it's not for you to offer me the presidency of the Senate, because the Senate is an independent organ which will decide on its leadership. And of course, when the Senate was eventually inaugurated and the House of Reps, Obasanjo made very serious efforts to impose a leadership and succeeded in doing that. But over time, the National Assembly has fought for its autonomy. It has acquired that autonomy, and now it's become so powerful that it's going even beyond the real powers it's supposed to exercise in the democratic process. And I think the time has now come to really do an assessment and for them to speak to each other, to work out the modality for working together on the basis of what the Constitution says in its intentions, but also in its letters. There has to be a learning process that's accelerated as we move into the Ninth Assembly, so that we do not reproduce the problems and difficulties we've had in the past.
When talking about the National Assembly or legislature generally, the Constitution gives the legislature powers. But again, there are legislative traditions that the legislature or members of the legislature also fall back on, either to act on, either to select their leadership, or even select chairman of their committees. For example, the Constitution emphatically states that the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee must come from the opposition. That's one. But looking at the constitutional power and the traditions over the years, what will you say as a professor of political science that should guide the emerging Ninth Assembly?
I think the first issue is the tradition of ranking members, which I think has been followed to a large extent, which is to say, although in law there's nothing that says a new member of the Senate cannot be a Senate president, but the National Assembly have come to understand that there is always a serious challenge when you put people in significant leadership positions who do not even know what the job is. Then they will spend a long time trying to learn the job. There has been a challenge in this country that for virtually after each electoral cycle, 80% of the National Assembly doesn't come back at all. This time, we still are still working out the arithmetic because the elections are not just completely over yet. But I think there's a significant improvement this time. And you are going to have maybe 60% that will not come back, which is a significant improvement with previous electoral cycles, which means there will be more ranking members available to fill the leadership positions. So it's important that that tradition is enforced throughout the life of the 9th Assembly. I think the other issue is competence. We sometimes have people appointed to leadership positions simply because those positions are assumed to be powerful positions. And they don't look at what's the qualification of these people that you put in that position. For example, the committees that have to do with security, it will be good if a significant number of those committee members have backgrounds in security agencies. So they are not coming to learn the job in the committee. They already have a track record. It's always good to, of course, mix professionals with others who are not experts in that field. But I think one of the key issues moving forward is really looking at the curriculum vitae of members and making sure those that are posted to specific committees are fit for purpose. I think the other issue has to do with the politics of the appointment into committees. One of the things that has emerged in our National Assembly is that the Senate President and the Speaker have disproportionate powers in making those assessments. So rather than a collegial approach where they all sit down and assess themselves and do the allocation, often it's just the Speaker or the President that will sit down with his pen and paper and appoint Mohammed Kudu to head the budget and that sort of thing. So I think we do hope that this time there will be a more collegial approach, which will also strengthen the hands of the National Assembly.
It's called the body of principal officers who should make those appointments.
Yes.
Just to explain the collegial tag you give it. But having said that, currently it appears history is repeating itself in terms of the modus operandi or the politics of persons who will emerge either as Senate President or Speaker or Deputy Speaker or Deputy Senate President. What are you reading? And then what are your thoughts?
Well, as you are aware, 2 days ago, the ruling APC announced persons it has nominated or proposed rather to be a Senate President and Speaker of the House. And that has led to an immediate reaction from some members of the party elected into these institutions who felt that the key principle is that they as legislators have the constitutional powers to elect whoever they want as their leadership. And I think it's very unfortunate that so early in the day such controversies emerging. I think what's important is really for the ruling party to reflect on the manner it is approaching this issue. The risk is, if they try to impose candidates in terms of leadership, they may have a revolt from their own members. And when that revolt comes out, then the situation will end up being much worse than what it was previously. I think they have to be extremely careful. There are two principles in conflict here. The one principle is that of party supremacy, that the party can take decisions, including on leadership, and what it decides stands. The other principle is the autonomy of the National Assembly and their right to choose whatever leadership they like. I think if you focus too much on the principle of party supremacy, you may end up losing control of a significant proportion of your members. And I'm surprised the ruling party did not reflect seriously on this issue, because in 2015, it was their approach to this issue that precipitated the crisis of a leadership they thought they did not want Imagine. And I think if they are not careful this time too, they may have a similar problem.
Are you saying it is not legitimate for a ruling party to prefer to have a candidate A or B as the leader of the legislature?
Oh, definitely. Ruling parties can have preference for the leadership they want to emerge. But then the Constitution is absolutely clear. The principle is not the desire of the ruling party, is the choice of members of both houses. Therefore, whatever the desire or wish of the ruling party, they must weigh that against the constitutional provision that the membership of the National Assembly can choose whoever they want to be leaders.
Let me follow up on
Right.
that. It does look like you're right, Prof, about the ruling party needing to reflect on its approach to these issues. Because you also see a certain kind of extreme, rhetoric. For instance, the party says it's a winner takes all thing. And so we're not likely to share certain committees with the opposition party. So the question would be, do you think that completely attempting to discountenance PDP and the opposition party is the right step to go with respect to national cohesion and stability? Because if you look at the scheme, the map of victory across the country, you see the PDP predominant in certain areas. And so you want to do some kind of approach that may further exclude areas that are already feeling a sense of exclusion. Do you think that the ruling party really needs to give more attention to this and focus more on national cohesion rather than this winner-takes-all approach that it seems to be bent on taking?
Well, you recall when the presidential election results were declared, President Buhari, in his address to the nation, promised a more inclusive approach to governance. That suggests that the president is aware, because you just need to look at the map of the presidential election. Nigeria was divided right down the middle, and that's always a bad sign for any emerging government. So the president is aware. The challenge now is, what does inclusive mean? Because that's where you start to face the challenge. I did see the statement by the chair of the ruling APC saying that they are not going to share posts with anybody. But Mohammed has just raised the issue about the Public Accounts Committee, for instance, which is a constitutional matter, so they don't even have a choice on that. But there's always something that's important in presidential democracies, that it's preferable you carry the other parties along so that you will agree much more easily on the key deliverables you want for the people of the country. It's not always possible, but if you do make an effort in that direction, you are able to achieve much more. And we have seen it in the United States of America, where up to about 15 years ago, they used to have very close collaboration between the two parties in developing legislative agenda and taking policy decisions that help the country. However, over the past few years, they've been very, very partisan. Each party completely rejects everything the other party says. And that has created a real crisis of governance in the United States of America. I think we should learn from that example and try to promote harmony, collaboration between ruling parties and opposition parties in the National Assembly, at least for certain issues that you feel are for the interests of the general population. And there are many such issues that are extremely important for us. We are suffering from really significant levels of poverty, significant levels of unemployment, and things like that. For those issues, there shouldn't be a partisan divide, because these are things that everybody in the country would benefit from. And I think that's the direction we need to go to.
And And part of the lessons, Prof, you've just mentioned, that's also, you agree with me that this just concluded elections came with a lot of surprises for our legislators. Now, what are some of the lessons to take out? And if they were to build a strong legislative institutions, you know, what are the shortcomings that should be addressed for this incoming 9th Assembly?
What types of surprises are you referring to?
A lot of people who wanted to be re-elected, you know, were not there. And we saw how also the Senate president is not also re-elected.
Well, these are not surprises. That's the normal work of citizens when they go to elections.
Well, for the individual.
They assess people, and if they like them, they feel they've performed, they re-elect them.
That's democracy in action.
Yes.
So what does this say to our democracy?
I think it's extremely positive.
Okay.
People used to believe in this country, when a governor finishes his 2 terms and wants to go to Senate, it's automatic that he must go there. And Nigerians are saying, no, it's not automatic. We have to decide. We are going to decide whether to return, whether to vote for you or not to vote for you. So I'm extremely happy and excited that the voters are exercising their sovereign right to choose who they want. And the fact that you're a big man or you're a governor is no longer a guarantee that you'll move to any specific position. It's also the same thing in terms of a second term for governors. I think that issue started right from 2003, but now we're having more of that when not all governors are guaranteed having a second term. And I think all this are signs of the consolidation and maturity of our democratic system. So we can only wish more of this continues.
Back to the issue of leadership recruitment and emergence, still in the National Assembly. You made reference to the American presidential system, but I want you to extrapolate that and come back to Nigeria. I don't think I've heard or read anywhere in the American system whereby, for example, the Republicans are not in the majority and then they will insist they want to come and contest for the speakership of the Congress, for example. But we are having that kind of scenario playing out in Nigeria.
Well, yes, I completely agree with you. When, for example, the opposition party decides it's going to contest for Senate President or Speaker, that's not the intention of the Constitution. Let me just divert a minute to the French model, where the requirement is the majority in the National Assembly must have a control of government. When a sitting president in France, for instance, goes through an election and the opposition party wins a majority in the National Assembly, then that opposition party must appoint the prime minister to form the government. So that's the system. And that's a question of governmental coherence. You want the executive to be in tune with the National Assembly so that the business of government can go smoothly. When you bring that back to the Nigerian system, the assumption is that whoever wins a majority in the National Assembly has the right to determine the leadership of that National Assembly, and that's the American tradition. However, politics is a complex and dynamic game, and what happened in 2015, in which the deputy Senate president emerged from the National Party, because
from the PDP.
From the PDP, in a context in which there was a plot in terms of the way in which the leadership emerged. You remember on that fateful day, there was a meeting at the conference center of APC legislators with the president. There was supposed to be a meeting. So some went there, others went to the National Assembly, and in that confusion, those who were in chambers quickly cooked up a system to take advantage of the disharmony that has emerged. That was what produced it. So now some people are beginning to think, okay, if we've had the opposition determining the deputy Senate president, why not just take the whole thing and get the Senate president itself? And again, the idea there will be a plot. That is, you try to drive a dividing line within the ruling party, get significant members of the ruling party to side with the opposition, and then determine the leadership. But that's really, really a very wrong approach. I think it creates a lot of disharmony in governmental function. And I will just correct myself quickly on one point. I've been talking a lot about ruling party and opposition party. Frankly, in a presidential system, you don't have an opposition party. You have a party in government that has won the election, and then you have other parties. But then there's this recognition that the party with the second largest number of seats is considered the opposition party, even if strictly speaking in political science terminology, it's not an opposition party. It's in the British system, the parliamentary system, where you have this formal division between a ruling party on the one hand and the loyal opposition, as they call it, on the other.
Okay, and Prof, earlier you talked about transparency and accountability. Now, what would be your recommendations in terms of management of legislative committees now towards adequacy and improved productivity of the incoming Ninth Assembly?
Well, I think for most Nigerians, one of their biggest concerns is a stop to the culture of padding. Padding, as I said earlier, is a uniquely Nigerian concept which we had never heard about in political science literature previously, where individual members of the National Assembly will put personal projects in the budget and then go back when it is approved or implemented to collect this monies personally. It's a complete distortion of the rules of the National Assembly. It is clear evidence of the growth of corruption in the National Assembly, and it's simply something that has to stop. I think what's important is we need to go back to basic principles of how the National Assembly operates. And the basic principle is this: every party that has won an election has done so on the basis of a manifesto. That manifesto outlines what they were going to do. Now, what happens in a normal situation is that that manifesto is translated by the executive into specific projects that are then inserted into the budget. Now, because in the National Assembly you have also members of this same party in the committees and in the leadership, then they are supposed to accept as normal that these are the things in our manifesto, which is collective, and therefore...
And should also defend that position.
Yeah, they should defend the budget of the government. But we have a total distortion in Nigeria, where rather than defend the budget of their own party and their own government, they turn around, essentially scatter the budget and fill it with all sorts of individual and selfish projects. That culture has to stop if we are going to progress, because the way we are going now, the budget will become totally meaningless. It will just be the personal projects of members of the National Assembly rather than the project developed by the party, presented to Nigerians in a manifesto, and they voted for that manifesto, and therefore expect what was in the manifesto will emerge as projects that are inserted and approved in the budget.
Well, to round off our Prof, where time is fast spent, we have talked about several issues that had emerged in the course of the tenure of the 8th National Assembly. Now, what are those bills or legislation you think are outstanding that the 9th National Assembly should be preoccupied with as it comes in June?
I think maybe the most important issue for the 9th National Assembly is addressing the issue of the cost of governance. You remember President Buhari in 2015 had announced that he will focus on reducing the cost of governance so that there will be more resources left for development. One of the things he had mentioned was the Oransenye report, which had studied this huge area of parastatals we have in this country, and pointed out a lot of them are duplicating the same roles, and that you could merge them and reduce the number significantly. And President Buhari had said he would focus on that in 2015, but because of the fractious relationship between the executive and the National Assembly, that never happened. So I think now that has to come back to the agenda. But the situation is even worse, because over the last 4 years, like I said earlier, so many new agencies have been created by the National Assembly. The President has refused to sign many of them, so they have not yet been signed, but others have been signed by the President. So there is a challenge that we are multiplying too many government agencies, and all the national budget is for is to pay for those agencies rather than projects that will help the people. So I think that's really a very important thing for the 9th Assembly, and this will require, one, there's harmony from day one. To have harmony from day one, allow the National Assembly decide on its leadership. Then whatever leadership emerges, cooperate with them, work with them, go along with them, so that the two sides of government, as it were, will work together for the good of the Nigerian people.
Will this require some sort of initiative from the executive to say, look, gentlemen and ladies, we need to implement the manifesto that we campaigned upon. So this is our own idea of engaging with you guys. This is our legislative agenda. You would have yours, but can we have an interface such that we have this harmony you talk about? Do you think that we should have that kind of initiative coming from the presidency?
You know, it's really a question of developing a culture of working together. In the United States, what they do, for example, is that the party will call a retreat, and the executive and the legislature will sit together quietly, and they'll say, okay, this is our manifesto, these are what we said we'll do. Let's focus on how do we achieve that. So they will discuss it and agree on the key issues before they even submit a budget, so that by the time that budget emerges, the legislature would have been aware that this is what we have planned collectively. So it's not something to argue about. And I think that sort of approach is extremely important. I think the danger for the ruling party this time around is this idea of, okay, we'll just impose party supremacy. You can't impose party supremacy on the legislature, because the legislature has a lot of constitutional protection. That means they can do what they want to do, whether or not you want them to do it.
Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, thank you so much for your time. Professor Jibrin Ibrahim is Senior Fellow, Center for Democracy and Development, and we thank you once again for your thoughts on assessment of the 8th National Assembly and including an agenda setting for the 9th Assembly.
It's a pleasure.
Ruth Aguele, it's many thanks all the time. Did I get the name right now?
Yes, you did. Thank you for having me.
Of course, Oke Epia is Executive Director of Older Paper, a legislative publication that dwells on the Nigeria's legislature, but particularly the National Assembly. Thank you once again for coming.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.
This edition of Platform has discussed, or rather assessed, the 8th National Assembly and tried to set agenda for the 9th National Assembly with a distinguished professor of political science, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim. That's Platform. Thank you for watching. See you again in the next edition. I'm Muhammad Kuda Wakar. Bye for now.